When Marine Corps Staff Sergeant Nina Brooks pulled her truck into the quiet rest stop off the Appalachian Highway, it felt like stepping back into a world that had almost forgotten her. After 3 brutal tours in the deserts of the Middle East, this small roadside stop looked almost too peaceful, too simple. The fading light of dusk hung like a shroud over the tired asphalt, and the buzzing neon sign of the old gas station flickered in the distance, casting a soft, eerily welcoming glow. Nina, a tall and well-built woman, guided her black Chevy Silverado into a parking spot near the pumps. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as she eased her vehicle to a stop. She hadn't even taken the time to change out of her uniform yet. She'd caught an earlier flight out of the base, eager to surprise her husband, James, and their 7-year-old son, Alex. They weren't expecting her back until next week, but after months of being stuck in a war zone, she was ready to surprise them with an early return. The evening air was warm and thick, just as she remembered it from her childhood in North Carolina. It had been almost 2 years since she'd been home, and that sense of familiarity wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. She climbed out of the truck, the soles of her combat boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. She stretched her back, feeling the stiffness of the long flight and the tension from months of non-stop action. At 31, Nina still looked younger than her age, though her piercing blue eyes betrayed a far more seasoned soul. Those eyes had seen things, the kind of things that haunted her dreams and stole the joy from her waking hours. She smiled as she pulled a folded drawing from her wallet, one Alex had sent her last month. It was a simple crayon sketch of their family, all smiles, with Alex's tiny handwriting beneath. "Mommy, come home soon. Love, Alex." It was a small thing, but it reminded her of what she was fighting for. Family, safety, peace. As she stood by the pump, waiting for the gas to fill, she noticed the rest stop was oddly quiet. There was a lone sedan parked near the convenience store, and inside, the elderly cashier, Frank, was reading a newspaper, oblivious to the world outside. A peaceful scene, a far cry from the chaos she had grown accustomed to. But then, the rumble of motorcycles broke through the calm. The sound, loud and aggressive, echoed off the trees lining the rest stop. Nina's combat instincts kicked in immediately. She turned her head slightly, watching as 3 large cruisers roared down the highway and turned into the rest stop. The bikes were all customized, glossy black paint jobs, chrome everywhere, the riders' leather jackets decorated with patches that Nina immediately recognized. Hell Riders MC. It didn't take much to read the situation. They were looking for trouble. The lead rider, a massive man with a long, scruffy beard, gave Nina a hard stare as he cruised past. She kept her face neutral, her posture relaxed but alert. Her military training had taught her to read situations before they escalated, and she immediately sensed that these bikers were not here for a friendly chat. The group parked in a row, their bikes taking up more space than necessary. They dismounted with a deliberate slowness, sizing Nina up, no doubt noticing her uniform. Nina continued to pump the gas, her movements smooth, but her mind was already calculating. The leader, a hulking figure with a vest that read Hell Riders President, began making his way toward her, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel with each step. "Look what we got here," the leader called out, his voice loud and dripping with mockery. "One of Uncle Sam's little soldiers. What's up, hero? Gonna make us salute you or something?" Nina didn't respond. She kept her gaze focused on the pump, ignoring the bait. She'd been through worse in the desert. Some guys just like to show off their bravado, hoping to provoke a reaction. But these bikers weren't done. The leader, who went by the nickname Bear, approached closer. Nina could smell the stale scent of cigarette smoke and cheap beer on his breath as he stopped just inches away, trying to intimidate with his size. "You think you're better than us in that uniform?" Bear growled. He reached out and bumped her shoulder as he passed by, forcing Nina to take a step back. Nina stayed calm. She had dealt with worse threats, ones that were much more dangerous. She kept her hands at her sides, knowing better than to engage unless absolutely necessary. But Bear and his crew weren't going to back off that easily. Nina's fingers tightened slightly, remembering the countless drills that had taught her how to defend herself in moments like these. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for a sign of weakness. Bear stopped in front of the convenience store, turned around and called out, "What's the matter, soldier? Don't you want to say something?" The two other bikers, smaller but no less menacing, hung back, watching Nina like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. The situation was escalating, but Nina knew one thing for sure. They had picked the wrong soldier. She gave them one last chance. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Walk away now, and this doesn't have to go any further." But Bear, drunk on bravado, took another step forward. "Or what, soldier? You gonna fight us?" Nina didn't flinch. She was a Marine, and she wasn't about to let these guys get the better of her. You won't believe what happens next. It's the last thing you'd expect, yet everything starts to change from here. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Sarah Miller stepped out onto the porch of her home, looking out across the quiet street. The evening was just beginning to settle, and she had just finished putting Emma to bed. She still couldn't shake the feeling of something being off, an unease that had been growing for weeks. James was due to arrive in a few days. After a year and a half of worrying, missing calls, and holding the family together while he served overseas, she could finally look forward to seeing him again. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry her through the long months of separation. Still, there was something on her mind. The call from her best friend, Jenna, kept echoing in her head. "Don't let him forget what it's like back here. He's been through so much, Sarah. He's not the same man who left." Of course, she knew that. She'd always known that returning soldiers sometimes found it hard to fit back into their old lives. James had always been strong, steady, and fiercely loving. But how could a man who'd faced life-or-death situations every day find normalcy again? She feared the day when the reality of war would catch up with him. Where are you watching from? Have you ever witnessed such a scene? If it were you, what would you do? Please comment publicly. My thoughts are in the comment line below. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to the channel to see more tomorrow. As Sarah was lost in thought, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart fluttering in her chest as she saw the familiar name. James was almost home. She couldn't wait to hear his voice again, to feel him close after so much time apart. But even as she dialed, she couldn't ignore that nagging feeling in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, the three bikers, Bear, Spike, and Snake, were still recovering from their humiliating encounter at the gas station. Each of them had their pride wounded, their tough guy reputations tarnished by the calm, controlled military man they had underestimated. Bear, especially, was seething. He had always been the leader, the one who instilled fear and respect in others, but something about that soldier had made him falter. The move James had executed, so clean, so efficient, had left him rattled. And it wasn't just his body that hurt. His pride had taken the hardest hit. The three of them sat in the dingy bar down the road from the gas station, nursing their beers in silence. No one wanted to speak first, but the air between them was thick with unspoken frustration. "You think that guy's just gonna forget about us?" Snake finally muttered, his voice low and bitter. "I say we go back and finish it." Bear glared at him, his heavy fingers tapping impatiently on the edge of his glass. "We're not going back, Snake. We're not stupid. We made our point, now we walk away. Trust me, I've seen soldiers like him before. They don't want trouble. We leave it alone." But Spike, who hadn't said a word since the incident, finally broke his silence. He was too damn calm. It felt like he wasn't even fazed by us. The thought hung in the air, settling between them like an unwelcome guest. Bear shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had crept into his chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to control a situation, but that soldier had done it effortlessly, with a calm that unnerved him. For the next few minutes, the group continued in silence, each man lost in his thoughts. Outside, the night deepened, and the quiet town of Wilson's Corner was shrouded in darkness once more. At the same time, Sarah was pacing back and forth in her living room, waiting for James to call. She had tried calling him first, but he hadn't picked up. She assumed he was either busy with his last-minute preparations or had simply missed the call. After all, she thought, he'd been through so much. A quick call wouldn't change anything, would it? Still, there was a tiny nagging feeling that refused to be quieted. Something was off. Something about tonight felt different. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, she muttered to herself, shaking her head. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The world they had once known, the one where she and James shared simple joys, was beginning to shift. There was something in the air, a tension building without either of them fully realizing it. And as for James, the long day and the unexpected confrontation at the gas station had left him with a strange feeling of foreboding. He couldn't shake the image of Bear, standing there with that sneer on his face, daring him to react. It wasn't the physical threat that bothered him. It was the reminder of how quickly situations could escalate, how easily things could spiral out of control. His hand reached for the steering wheel of his truck as he drove closer to home, trying to push the thoughts from his mind. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that something he couldn't quite place, was coming for him. And it wouldn't be long before it reached his doorstep. James turned the corner onto his street, the headlights of his truck casting long shadows across the pavement. It had been a long, exhausting journey back from the base, and the thought of finally being home, of seeing Sarah and Emma again, gave him a rush of relief. But even as the familiar sights of the neighborhood came into view, a gnawing tension pulled at him. The events earlier that day, his confrontation with Bear and the two other bikers, kept replaying in his mind. His training told him to stay calm, to walk away from conflict whenever possible, but the back of his mind kept whispering that something wasn't right. He parked the truck in his driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, staring at the empty porch. Sarah had been expecting him, and she would be waiting, probably pacing, maybe feeling just as restless as he had when he was away. The front door opened, and there she was, Sarah. Her silhouette stood out against the warm glow of the interior lights, her face lighting up when she saw him. It had been far too long. James. She rushed down the steps, her eyes glistening with emotion. He could see the relief, the love, and the uncertainty all mixed into one in the way she looked at him. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite place. They embraced fiercely, holding on to each other like they had never been apart, Sarah's hands running over the back of his neck, as if making sure he was really there. "You're finally home," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I've missed you so much." "I missed you too," he murmured, pulling her closer. "I'm sorry it took so long." But even as they stood there, enveloped in each other's arms, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. As Sarah pulled back to look at him, her hands still resting on his shoulders, her expression shifted slightly. She studied him with a quiet intensity, her gaze searching his face as though trying to find the man she once knew. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "You look different." He hesitated before responding. "I'm fine, just a little worn out." She nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "You've been through so much. I don't want you to feel like you have to be strong for me, James. We'll take it one day at a time. Together." Her words were comforting, but a part of him still felt like there was a wall between them, a distance that hadn't been there before. It wasn't that he didn't want to be close to her. It was just that everything had changed. He had changed. Before he could respond, the sound of a car engine revving echoed down the street. Sarah glanced over his shoulder toward the road. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. James turned, instinctively reaching for the gun at his side, his training kicking in before his thoughts could catch up. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, just a few houses lit up by the streetlights. But the noise, the harsh revving of an engine, didn't sit right with him. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. But Sarah didn't budge. "James, what's going on?" "I said stay inside." His tone left no room for argument. He had been trained to assess threats in an instant, and something about this felt wrong, dangerously so. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes flashing with something close to defiance. But she nodded, stepping back reluctantly toward the door. "Please be careful." James didn't wait for her to finish. He had already started moving toward the sound of the engine, his senses heightened. The house was quiet now, too quiet, and every instinct told him to trust his gut. As he stepped off the porch, The unmistakable growl of the engine grew louder. James's hand was on the grip of his gun as he moved down the driveway, eyes scanning every shadow for signs of movement. The car turned the corner. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the make and model. It was a black muscle car, one that didn't belong in Wilson's Corner. The car slowed as it approached, headlights cutting through the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, disappearing down the street. James stood still for a moment, watching the empty road. His instinct screamed at him to chase after it, to figure out who was behind the wheel and what they wanted. But he resisted. It could have been anyone, a wrong turn, a lost driver. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. It was the same feeling he had when he first encountered Bear and his gang. The feeling that something was about to happen, something that he couldn't stop. He turned back to the house, walking slowly toward the front door. As he stepped inside, Sarah was waiting, her face etched with worry. "James," she began. "What happened?" "It's nothing," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm just being paranoid." But deep down, he knew it wasn't nothing. He had learned the hard way to trust his instincts, and something was definitely brewing. The hours after the car's sudden appearance were long and sleepless. James couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful life in Wilson's Corner was slipping through his fingers, like sand through an open hand. The town had always been quiet, secure, and predictable, but now, every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig outside, seemed loaded with meaning. Sarah had gone to bed earlier, though she had been restless too. He could tell by the way she shifted beside him, even in her sleep, as if she sensed the same unease that gripped him. But he couldn't let her know. Not yet. As the moon cast pale light through the windows, James rose from the bed and moved to the living room. His eyes scanned the shadows in the corners, but there was nothing unusual. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. His fingers brushed against the scar on his left hand, the reminder of his time in combat, before he had left it all behind for the promise of a quiet life. But now, he wasn't sure that life was still waiting for him. The sound of a phone vibrating on the coffee table startled him. He hadn't realized he'd left it there. His hand moved instinctively, and he picked it up. There was a text from an unknown number. "We know where you are, soldier." His heart rate spiked. The message was short, cryptic, and threatening. He knew it wasn't some prank. There was a chill that crawled up his spine as the words sank in. It was a message meant for him. The question was, from who? He quickly pulled up the contact list and checked his missed calls. Nothing. Just that one message. But it left him with a sinking feeling in his stomach. The world outside was still dark, but his mind was racing. His training told him to stay alert, but also to think, to calculate. It could be anyone with a reason to hold a grudge. But why would they be targeting him now, after all this time? He sent a quick text back, hoping to get some kind of response. "Who is this?" He waited, watching the screen. No reply. The seconds dragged on, then minutes. The absence of an answer made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Just as he set the phone down, Sarah appeared in the doorway. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the tension in the room. "James? What's wrong?" He turned to her, trying to mask the worry that had overtaken him. "Nothing, just trying to figure something out." She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. "You've been on edge all day," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Are you sure you're all right?" He opened his mouth to say something reassuring, but the words didn't come. Instead, he glanced back toward the window. "You saw the car, didn't you?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Sarah nodded, her expression troubled. "I did. It didn't feel right. I don't know why, but I had the same feeling you did." James sighed, his hand running over his face as he tried to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. "I think it's more than just a bad feeling," he said finally. "Something's going on in this town, and I don't think it's going to stay quiet for long." She stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "What are you going to do?" He glanced at the phone, the unread message burning into the screen. "I don't know yet, but I need to find out who's behind this, before it's too late." She hesitated, her gaze softening. "James, be careful. I don't want you to get hurt. I know, he said, his voice tinged with regret. I don't want to drag you into this either. But if I'm right, whatever's coming, it's going to affect us all. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, her or himself. But Sarah's worried expression didn't ease his mind. She had been through too much already, and now this. It wasn't fair, but the threat was real. Whoever was behind it, whoever had sent that message, was out there, and they weren't just going to go away. James moved toward the door, grabbing his jacket off the coat rack. I'm going to take a drive. I need to clear my head. Sarah's voice stopped him before he could step outside. Please, James, don't do anything rash. Talk to me first. He turned, meeting her eyes for a long moment. His chest tightened with guilt. She was right to be concerned. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them, about their family. I'll be back soon, he said, his voice firm but soft. Stay inside, okay? She nodded reluctantly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, he said, the words slipping out more easily than he had expected. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also didn't want to burden her with everything on his mind. With one last look, James stepped out into the night. The cold air hit him as he walked to his truck, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something in his gut told him that whatever it was, it wouldn't be easy to find. The town of Wilson's Corner, with all its quiet streets and small-town charm, was hiding something, and James was going to uncover it, even if it meant digging through every shadow, every lie, and every dangerous secret. James drove through the winding streets of Wilson's Corner, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. The night was unnaturally still, as though the town was holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't quite grasp. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of grass and the occasional mailbox, but it all felt distant, as though he were driving through someone else's life. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. The car from earlier had disappeared just as quickly as it had arrived, and despite his gut feeling that something wasn't right, there was no clear evidence to point to. The message on his phone was the only tangible thing to go on. But even that could be a bluff, an empty threat from someone trying to rattle him. Still, there was no peace in sitting at home and wondering. If he didn't take action now, whatever threat was lurking in the shadows of this town might be long gone by the time he figured it out. He reached the outskirts of town, where the trees thinned out and the land opened up into farmland. It was quieter here, the occasional creak of a windmill or the rustle of leaves the only sounds breaking the silence. He pulled over at the old service station, closed now, but it had been a familiar landmark during his time growing up. It was a place of memories, though the kind that James usually tried to avoid thinking about. He hadn't been back here in years, not since he'd left for the military, and even now, the station seemed to hold onto a certain weight. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel as he surveyed the area. There was nothing outwardly suspicious, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He knew something was off. Suddenly, a flash of light caught his eye, a pair of headlights coming down the long stretch of road. The car was moving slowly, cautiously, as though the driver was making sure no one saw them. James squinted, trying to make out the model, but the car was too far for any details to be clear. He had a gut feeling it wasn't just a passing motorist. He sat still, watching the car approach. His instincts told him not to move, to wait and observe. The car came closer, and just as it passed, it slowed down even further, almost as if it were waiting for something. Or someone. Without thinking, James turned the ignition and followed. The car took a sharp turn off the main road, heading down a narrow dirt path that led to a secluded part of town, toward the old woods where the abandoned house sat. The house had been empty for as long as James could remember, a remnant of the town's past that no one had bothered to tear down. It was a place whispered about by the locals, always associated with strange stories and rumors. James had never thought much of it, until now. Something in the way the car moved toward that house made his blood run cold. It was deliberate, and that meant whoever was in that car had a reason to be here. He increased his speed, careful to stay far enough behind not to alert the driver, but close enough to follow. The road was rough, rutted, but his truck handled it well enough. His eyes never left the taillights of the car as they bounced over the uneven ground. The path eventually opened up into a clearing, and there, standing in the shadows of the trees, was the old house. The car pulled up to the front, stopping in front of the dilapidated porch. The headlights briefly illuminated the house before the car shut off. For a moment, everything was quiet. James stopped at a safe distance, parking his truck behind a clump of trees. He killed the engine and sat still, listening. He couldn't see much from where he was, but he could make out the outline of the car and the shadows moving inside the house. Something was happening in there. His breath caught as he considered his next move. He couldn't just walk in there blindly. The last thing he wanted was to walk into a trap, especially if the person in that car was somehow connected to the strange message he had received earlier. But he also knew that if he waited too long, whatever was happening might be over by the time he got there. A soft thud echoed from the direction of the house. Footsteps. Someone was leaving the car. James quickly ducked down, pressing his back to the side of his truck. He peered through the window, watching as a figure moved toward the house. It was hard to make out much in the dark, but the figure was tall, their movements deliberate. They paused at the door of the house, as if checking something, perhaps the lock. Then the door creaked open, and they disappeared inside. James hesitated for a moment before reaching for the door handle. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. If he was going to get answers, he had to move fast. He stepped out of the truck, the night air biting at his skin. As quietly as possible, he moved toward the house, keeping low and using the shadows for cover. The tall figure had disappeared inside, and the house now stood silent, dark, and ominous in front of him. James took a deep breath and approached the front porch. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he made his way up. Every step felt louder than the last, but he couldn't afford to hesitate now. He reached for the door, ready to turn the knob, when suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Looking for something?" James froze. The voice was calm, almost too calm, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the small firearm tucked in the back of his waistband. Standing in the doorway was another figure, a second person. This time, James could see him clearly. A tall man, wearing a long coat, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The man was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, predatory. James didn't move, his eyes narrowing. "I asked you a question," the man repeated, his voice tinged with an edge of menace. James tightened his grip on the gun, but kept it holstered for now. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "What's going on here?" The man chuckled softly, stepping further into the light. "What makes you think you're the one asking the questions, soldier?" The chill in the air deepened. James could feel it now. He wasn't just out for answers. He was on the edge of something much darker, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The man's smile never wavered as he stepped closer, his footsteps soft but deliberate. James instinctively took a step back, his senses on high alert. The situation had shifted from one of cautious curiosity to one of imminent danger. The air around him felt charged, as if something was about to break. "You're not from around here anymore, are you?" The man's voice was smooth, but there was a razor-like sharpness to it that made the hairs on the back of James's neck prickle. James didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the man, assessing him. His instincts screamed at him to keep his distance. The man wasn't just a local, and he certainly wasn't here by accident. Everything about him, from his cold smile to his self-assured stance, suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "I'm not looking for trouble," James said slowly, his voice even, "but I need answers. What's going on here? And what's your connection to the car I followed?" The man raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the question. "Answers? You're asking the wrong questions, my friend. You're already too far in." James clenched his jaw, trying to remain calm, but the sudden sense of being cornered made his heart race. "I don't have time for games," he said. "I'm not leaving without answers." The man's smile faded slightly, his expression turning colder. "I think you'll find you don't have a choice, soldier." James's hand twitched near his waistband. The man noticed the subtle movement, and chuckled darkly. "You think a gun will make this go away?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. "Trust me, it won't. But maybe you're right about one thing. You deserve an answer." Without warning, the man gestured to the house behind him. "Come inside. Let's talk. You're not going to get what you want out here." James hesitated, his eyes darting to the darkened interior of the house. Every instinct screamed for him to back off, to turn around and get the hell out of there. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Curiosity, fear, or perhaps a sense of duty that wouldn't let him walk away. The man seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's either that or I walk away, and trust me, I won't be the one looking for you next." James made a decision. He could take the chance to step inside, and maybe, just maybe, he'd get the answers he needed. Or he could walk away and risk never learning what was really going on in Wilson's corner. Either way, there was no going back. He pushed open the door, the old wood creaking in protest. The inside of the house was colder than the air outside, and the dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room. The walls were bare, the floors worn and creaky, but the sense of abandonment was thick. It felt like the house had been forgotten, but not in the way most places were. It felt like it had been purposefully left behind, as if it was waiting for something. The man stepped inside, and James followed cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. The walls seemed to close in around him as the door clicked shut behind him. "Sit," the man said, motioning to a worn-out chair in the corner of the room. There was no real warmth to his voice, just a flat command. James didn't argue. He sat, keeping his eyes on the man. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the occasional creak of the house settling in the silence. James felt every second tick by, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what game this man was playing, but he had to see it through now. The man finally spoke, his voice colder now, more direct. "You're here because you're trying to uncover something you don't understand. But you're too late. The game has already started, and you're just a pawn." James leaned forward in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. "What game? Who the hell are you?" The man didn't flinch. "I told you. You're asking the wrong questions. You're here because you followed a car that was never meant to be seen. You're here because you've uncovered something buried deep in this town, something no one wants you to know." James's pulse quickened. "And what is that? What are you hiding?" The man's smile returned, but this time it was something darker. "It's not a question of hiding, my friend. It's a question of survival. There are things in this town, things that have been here far longer than you or I. And there are people who would do anything to keep it that way." James's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the conversation. "What the hell does that mean? Are you saying there's something supernatural going on here?" The man's expression grew more serious, the smile fading completely. "Call it what you want. But there are forces at play here that you can't even begin to understand. Forces that have been controlling this town for generations." James leaned back, trying to process the words. "And you're one of them?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward a dusty bookshelf and pulled down a thick, leather-bound book. He flipped it open, revealing pages filled with strange symbols and diagrams that made James's head spin. The pages looked ancient, the ink faded with time, but the symbols, they were unmistakable. James felt his stomach tighten as the man turned the book toward him, revealing a drawing on the page. It was a map, but not just any map. It was a map of Wilson's Corner. And on that map were several locations marked in red, each one representing a different part of the town. Each one was circled with a strange symbol James didn't recognize. The map was old, the edges worn and frayed, but it was clear enough. The entire town seemed to be marked as part of a larger design, something deliberate. "What is this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned closer, his face now inches from James's. "The town is the key," he said, his voice a low growl. "And you've just walked right into the heart of it." James swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling in. There was no turning back now. "Then what happens next?" James asked, his voice steady despite the growing fear in his chest. The man's smile returned, but it was no longer comforting. It was a predator's smile. Now? Now, we see how far you're willing to go to uncover the truth, and whether you're ready to pay the price for it. The man's words hung in the air, thick with tension. James could feel the blood pounding in his ears, the fear beginning to settle deep in his chest. There was something about the way the man spoke, so certain, so cold, that made him feel like a child caught in a game much bigger than he could comprehend. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to back down. Pay the price? James echoed, his voice tight. What are you talking about? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to a corner of the room, where an old, dusty chest sat under a heavy tarp. He bent down and with a slow, deliberate motion, pulled the tarp aside. The chest was small, but ornate, carved with strange symbols that matched the ones in the book. He opened it with a creak, revealing its contents. Inside was a collection of items: a vial of dark liquid, several worn pieces of parchment, and something that made James's stomach twist: a bone, yellowed with age and stained with dark, dried markings. The bone was too large to be human. It looked almost animal, but the shape was wrong, twisted in ways that defied biology. "Do you see it?" the man asked, his voice low and almost reverent. "This is what keeps them here. What holds this town together?" James stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What is this? What are you doing?" The man didn't answer right away, instead taking the bone from the chest and holding it up to the light, as if inspecting it. "You don't understand, do you? This town isn't just some random place. It was built on something ancient." James's heart skipped a beat. The man was talking about more than just a town. He was talking about something else, something dark. "Is this some kind of ritual?" James asked, trying to piece together the fragments of what the man was saying. "What are you trying to summon?" The man turned toward him, his eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of amusement and something darker, something predatory. "Summon? No, this isn't about summoning. This is about keeping something locked away. It's about control." He placed the bone back into the chest, gently as if it were something sacred, then closed the lid with a soft thud. The price of knowledge is always high. You know that, don't you? Once you start digging, once you begin to understand the truth, you can't unsee it. And if you're not careful, you'll be sucked in, just like everyone else who's tried to uncover it. James was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole situation, something that made him feel as if he were standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing but darkness below. "You're telling me this town is built on something unnatural?" James finally asked. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving James's face. "You could say that. The land here is different. It's been this way for centuries. The people who came here didn't know what they were getting into. But over time, they learned how to harness it, how to keep it contained. That's why Wilson's Corner is the way it is, why it's always felt off. It's a place of balance, a place where the lines between the real and the unreal are thin." James swallowed, his throat dry. "And what's the cost? What happens to people who get too close?" The man's expression darkened. "They disappear. Or worse, they get pulled into it, into the town's secrets, into the force that's kept it alive all these years." "You're asking questions you don't want answers to." James clenched his fists at his sides, trying to suppress the rising panic. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best effort to stay calm. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Now? Now you decide if you're willing to keep going. Because if you are, you're not just a witness anymore. You're part of it. And once you're in, there's no going back." James's pulse quickened, the weight of the man's words sinking in. This wasn't just about finding answers. It was about becoming a part of something much larger, much darker than he had ever imagined. The quiet town he'd stumbled into was hiding secrets that could destroy everything he thought he knew about the world. A chill ran through him as the realization hit. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. But that's what drove him, wasn't it? The need to know. The need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. "I'm not afraid," James said, forcing the words out even as his inside screamed for him to run. The man regarded him with an inscrutable look. Everyone is afraid. They just don't know it yet. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside. The room felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few minutes. Finally, the man took a step forward, his voice now softer, almost like a whisper. If you're determined to keep going, you'll need help. You can't do this alone. James blinked, confused. Help? From who? The man's smile returned, a slow, knowing grin. There are others who've been down this road. Some who've come before you. Some who are still here, hiding in plain sight. You'll find them, if you look hard enough. They'll help you. Or maybe they'll use you. Either way, you'll find them. Just be careful who you trust. The weight of his words hung in the air, the sense of inevitability pressing down on James. Whatever this was, whatever game was being played, it was bigger than he had imagined. And now, whether he liked it or not, he was in it. The man turned toward the door, his movement fluid and controlled. "Good luck, soldier," he said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "You'll need it." James didn't respond. He was too lost in thought, his mind racing as the man stepped out of the room, leaving him alone in the dark. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the briefest of moments, James felt the weight of the silence envelop him, closing in like a vice. He stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The answers he had sought were within reach, but they came with a price. And now that he had tasted the first bitter sip of that truth, there was no going back. But he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. He wasn't sure if anyone ever could be. The night was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that howled through the trees outside. James stood motionless in the center of the room, his mind whirling with everything the man had just told him. He had always known there was something strange about Wilson's Corner, something just out of reach, like a dream half-remembered. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he realized how deep the mystery went and how dangerous it was. He walked over to the chest the man had opened, his hand hovering just above the surface of the worn wood. His fingers itched with curiosity, but a sense of foreboding made him hesitate. The objects inside, the bone, the vial, the parchment, were all tied to something ancient, something that James could barely begin to understand. But the idea of leaving them undisturbed gnawed at him. Could he really walk away from this? Could he leave the secrets of Wilson's Corner hidden forever? A part of him wanted to. The other part, the one that had been driving him since he first arrived, wanted to know the truth, no matter what it cost. He shook his head, taking a deep breath. He had no choice but to keep going. He had to know. The town's strange, quiet pull had already wrapped around him. The question now wasn't if he should continue. He already knew the answer to that. It was whether he could survive what came next. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he slowly bent down and opened the chest. The smell of old leather and dust filled the air. His fingers brushed over the vial first, a strange, viscous liquid that shimmered a deep, unnatural shade of red. It glowed faintly in the low light, its surface reflecting the faintest hint of moonlight from the window. He hesitated before picking it up, but then unscrewed the cap. A heavy, metallic scent filled the air, the same as when he had been near the bone. The smell was unnerving, almost like blood. He set the vial aside and reached for the parchment. The paper was brittle to the touch, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible in parts. Strange symbols adorned the edges, their meaning lost to time. But there was no mistaking the purpose of the writing, a map. It was a crude sketch, but the landmarks were unmistakable. Wilson's Corner. The same town he had wandered into. The same town that felt off-kilter. The edges of the map were marked with ominous warnings. Do not disturb, leave it be, never open the door. James felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had no idea what he was truly getting himself into, but he knew one thing. The truth about Wilson's Corner was buried deep. It was more than just the people, more than just the town. It was tied to something older, something dangerous. He put the map back into the chest and closed it, his mind racing. What had the man meant by help? And who were these others he had mentioned? People who had come before him. People who were still here. It was too much to process in a single breath, and yet he could feel it all starting to converge. The man's words echoed in his mind. Once you're in, there's no going back. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the room, faint but deliberate. James quickly stepped away from the chest, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved to the window, careful not to make a sound as he peeked through the curtains. There was a figure standing in the street below, tall, cloaked, and moving with purpose. James couldn't make out any details, but something about the figure made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The figure paused for a moment, seemingly aware of something, watching, waiting, and then moved away, disappearing down the street as quietly as it had arrived. James didn't wait a moment longer. He grabbed his jacket, tucked the map into his pocket, and moved toward the door. The night outside was cold, and the town seemed even quieter now, as though holding its breath. He stepped out into the street, the chill biting at his skin. The town seemed empty, but he knew it wasn't. People were here, hidden in plain sight, just as the man had said. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign, anything that could lead him to the answers he needed. The figure he had seen earlier was nowhere to be found, but something else caught his attention, a soft glow emanating from the far side of town, where the old church stood. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was there, and it seemed to call to him. With little more than instinct guiding him, James started toward it, his footsteps muffled against the damp cobblestone. The glow grew stronger as he drew closer, and he could feel the weight of the town pressing down on him, the air growing heavier with every step. The church loomed ahead, its spire reaching up to the heavens like a finger pointing to something far beyond the earth. He approached the door, the heavy wood creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, the glow was brighter, almost blinding. But it wasn't the light that caught his attention. It was the people. There were figures standing in the shadows, watching him, their faces obscured by the darkness. They didn't move, but their eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, as if they had been waiting for him all along. "You came," a voice whispered from the shadows. James stiffened, his heart racing. He couldn't see the speaker, but he knew they were there, waiting for him. "I told you," the voice continued, a soft chuckle in its tone. "You can't escape once you start looking. The price has already been paid. Now, you belong to us." The air seemed to tighten around him, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. The door had closed behind him with an eerie finality, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than the room could possibly allow. He had stepped into something far deeper than he had anticipated. The cost of knowledge was no longer a distant theory. It was real, and it was here. James didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, he was no longer alone. The darkness in the church seemed to close in on James, its weight pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispered voice echoed in his mind, sending shivers down his spine. "You belong to us." His legs moved involuntarily, drawing him deeper into the church, despite his instinct to run. The flickering glow from an unseen source lit the figures around him, casting long, twisted shadows that danced like specters on the stone walls. They were silent, unmoving, watching. James couldn't see their faces clearly, but he could feel their eyes on him. They were all there. He had no idea how many, but their presence felt overwhelming. His pulse raced as he tried to steady himself, his hand instinctively reaching for the map in his pocket. The edges of it crinkled beneath his fingers, reminding him of the connection he had just made between the town and the ancient secrets hidden within. The voice, still soft, yet impossibly close, spoke again. "You came seeking the truth. But truth has a price, James. You've already paid." He turned, trying to find the source of the voice, but saw nothing. The glow became brighter, sharper, almost blinding, but it did nothing to alleviate the weight that was suffocating him. It was as if the church itself was alive, breathing with him, pulling him deeper into its embrace. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as if it were no longer solid. The walls of the church groaned, distorting as if reality itself were warping around him. Panic surged within James, but he fought it down, forcing himself to stay focused. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to understand what was happening. But as his eyes scanned the room, he realized with dread that the door through which he had entered had vanished. The church was now a maze of light and shadow, and he was lost within it. You sought knowledge. Now you will understand, the voice said, this time closer, far too close. The air grew colder, and James shivered as something cool brushed against his neck. He spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced, the cold sweat on his skin chilling in the stillness. He was surrounded by the shadows, by the figures, and by something far older than any of them. The truth he had been so desperate to uncover was closing in around him. Who are you? James shouted, his voice hoarse. What do you want from me? The shadows seemed to stir at his words, but there was no answer. Instead, the floor beneath his feet shifted once more, this time splitting open, revealing a deep pit where the church's foundation should have been. A foul smell, earth and rot, rose from the dark abyss. The whisper returned, colder now, almost mocking. Do you want to leave, James? It is too late to turn back. Before he could react, the ground under his feet trembled, and a pair of hands, pale and skeletal, reached up from the pit, grabbing his ankles with an unrelenting grip. He stumbled, trying to pull away, but it was no use. The hands held fast, and James felt himself being dragged toward the pit, toward the blackened maw that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A scream tore from his throat as he fought against the pull, his nails scraping against the cold stone floor. But the hands were too strong, their grip unyielding. As the shadows closed in, James caught a glimpse of something in the pit, glowing eyes, endless and dark, staring back at him. You are already ours, the voice said again, this time with a finality that sent terror through his veins. But then, something strange happened. A flash of light, a sharp, blinding burst, illuminated the entire room, momentarily banishing the shadows. The hands loosened their grip on James, and he scrambled backward, breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up, his eyes adjusting to the sudden change. The figures in the shadows were no longer still. They were moving now, slowly, purposefully. The glow had dimmed, but it was still enough to reveal their faces. James froze. They weren't human. Their features were twisted, their eyes wide and unblinking, with skin like old parchment, cracked and brittle. Their mouths were slightly ajar, as though they were waiting to speak, or waiting for something. It was as though they were all part of the same being, a collective consciousness that had existed for centuries, watching, waiting. One of them stepped forward, the others parting to allow it passage. It was taller than the rest, its movements unervingly graceful, as if it were gliding over the floor rather than walking. As it approached James, he could feel the air grow colder still, the pressure in his chest tightening. You are not ready, the figure said, its voice a deep, resonating echo. Its words seemed to reverberate within James's skull, filling his mind with dread. I don't understand, James stammered. I need to know. What is this place? Why did you bring me here? The figure regarded him silently for a moment before speaking again, its voice softer now, but no less chilling. You seek knowledge of this town, but knowledge is not free. It demands a cost. The truth will break you. It will undo you. You have already begun to pay, and now, you must finish what you started. The figure reached out, and James instinctively recoiled. But the creature's hand hovered just in front of his face, its fingers trembling with some unseen power. The glow around it intensified, casting sharp, twisted shadows across the room. You have been marked, it said, its tone more menacing. This place will never let you go. James felt a sharp, sudden pain shoot through his chest. He gasped, stumbling back, clutching at his heart. It felt as though something was tearing him apart from the inside. His vision blurred, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What are you doing to me? He managed to choke out. You will see it soon enough, the figure said, its voice becoming more distant. You will understand in time. The pain in James's chest flared again, and the world around him began to spin. He fought to stay conscious, But it was too much. The darkness pulled at him, drawing him toward the pit again. And then, all at once, the pain stopped. James collapsed to the ground, his body limp and exhausted. The church had fallen silent again, the figures retreating into the shadows, leaving him alone in the center of the room. The glow had dimmed, and the floor beneath him felt solid once more. But something was different. The air was heavier, charged with an unseen presence. James couldn't explain it, but he could feel it now, deep within his bones. He had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The truth was within reach, but at a price he hadn't yet fully understood. And somewhere, in the heart of Wilson's Corner, the darkness was watching. James knew this was just the beginning. James lay on the cold, stone floor, his breath shallow and uneven. His mind swam, a sea of confusion and fear, as fragments of the events that had just unfolded replayed in his mind. He could still feel the cold fingers of the shadowed figures, their touch seeping into his very soul, and the unrelenting pressure of the darkness that had nearly consumed him. He tried to push himself to his feet, but his body felt weak, his limbs trembling with exhaustion. The church, now eerily silent, seemed to mock his struggles. He had survived the pit, barely, but at what cost? He couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong, as though the air itself had been infected by the darkness. The distant echoes of whispers still lingered in his ears, faint and insistent, urging him to understand, to unravel the truth. He could hear them, even now, like distant murmurs from the past, stretching through time, reaching him from some unfathomable place. They seemed to call to him, pulling at him with a power beyond his comprehension. "Get up," a voice rasped, its sound sharp and crackling like dry leaves in the wind. James blinked, his head spinning, as his eyes refocused on the space around him. He had almost forgotten about the strange markings on the walls, the symbols that seemed to shift in and out of view. They had been there all along, hidden beneath the layers of dust and decay. Now, they glowed faintly in the dim light, their forms fluid and alive, as if they were beckoning him forward. With a grunt, James managed to push himself to his feet, his body protesting the movement. His legs were shaky, but he forced himself to move, driven by the need to find answers. As he stepped closer to the markings, he could feel a strange pull, as if the symbols were drawing him in. He reached out a tentative hand, and as his fingers brushed against the stone, a shock of cold electricity surged through him. His vision blurred for a moment, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like an inescapable storm. "James, James, listen to us." He jerked his hand back, but the connection had already been made. The symbols on the wall flickered, shifting like liquid, and for the briefest moment, he saw faces within them. Faces that were both familiar and foreign, their eyes filled with the same overwhelming sense of dread he had felt earlier. Faces from his past, from his present, from places he had never been. And in that fleeting moment, he understood. He was not alone. He had never been alone. The church seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, as though the very stones were alive, breathing. The air was thick with something ancient, something forgotten. James realized that the truth he sought was not just buried in the town's history. It was embedded in the very fabric of the land, in the bones of Wilson's Corner itself. But why him? Why had he been chosen to uncover this terrible secret? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the whispering voice returned, this time clearer, more distinct. "You are not the first to seek the truth, but you are the first to understand the cost." James froze, the weight of the words settling heavily in his chest. The cost. He had heard those words before, but now they held a deeper, more terrifying meaning. The truth had a price, one that seemed to reach beyond the physical realm, beyond the borders of the town and the church. He wasn't just facing a local mystery. He was facing something far greater, something older than humanity itself. The walls began to shake, and James stumbled backward, his heart racing. The floor cracked beneath his feet, the sound like thunder echoing through the chamber. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter now, almost blinding, and in the center of the room, a crack appeared in the stone, as if the earth itself were tearing open. He watched in horror as the crack widened, revealing a deep, inky blackness that seemed to stretch infinitely downward. The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified, filling his mind with images of endless darkness, of forgotten horrors, of things that had once ruled the earth and would one day return to claim it. James wanted to run. He wanted to flee, to escape the nightmare that had become his reality. But his feet were rooted to the spot, his body unwilling to obey. The darkness before him was pulling him in, its cold tendrils reaching toward him, as if it recognized him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. And then, in the depths of the abyss, he saw something. Something moving. Something alive. A pair of eyes, large, round, and unblinking, stared up at him from the blackness. The eyes were not human, not even animal. They were alien, unrecognizable, and yet they seemed to see right through him, into the very core of his being. "You are ours," the voice said again, now unmistakable, echoing through the church like a funeral dirge. "You always were." A wave of nausea swept over James as the ground trembled beneath him. The darkness began to rise, as if the pit were alive, its boundaries expanding outward, reaching for him. The air was thick with dread, the pressure in his chest almost unbearable. He could feel the darkness trying to swallow him whole. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the pull of the abyss loosened. The eyes disappeared, and the crack in the floor began to close, the stones shifting back into place as though they had never moved. James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Sweat trickled down his face, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He had been so close to understanding. But now, the truth felt further away than ever. The church was silent again, its cold walls pressing in on him, the shadows now still and watchful. He didn't know how long he stood there, unable to move, unable to think. But when he finally found the strength to tear his eyes away from the now sealed crack, he saw something else in the distance. A figure standing in the doorway, watching him. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. But something about them seemed wrong, something intangible that he couldn't place. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. "You have seen the beginning," the figure said, its voice soft and yet full of weight. "Now you must face the end." James's heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking the implications of those words. He had already crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The figure moved toward James with a sense of inevitability, its presence casting an unsettling shadow across the room. It was not the shape or form of the person that struck fear into him. It was the feeling, the way the air grew denser with each step the figure took, as though the world itself was bending around it. James felt the pull again, stronger than before. The whispers had returned, louder now, weaving themselves into a dissonant symphony of voices, each one trying to be heard over the others. It was as if they were coming from every direction, filling his mind with fragmented thoughts, half-forgotten memories, and the terrible certainty that something was about to happen, something he would not be able to stop. "Who are you?" James managed to croak, his voice hoarse from the tension that gripped him. His throat felt dry, as if the words themselves were choking him. The figure stopped in front of him, its face still obscured by shadow. James could see no distinguishing features, just an outline, a vague silhouette, yet it radiated a sense of recognition, a feeling that he had known this presence, or something like it, all his life. But where? And how? "You ask who I am," the figure said, its voice low and resonant, like the hum of a distant bell. "I am what you have always known, what you have always feared. I am the truth you've sought, the end you've tried to avoid." James took an instinctive step back, his pulse quickening. The figure's words wrapped around him like chains, binding him to some inescapable fate. He had never been one for destiny or fate, but in this moment, he felt their grip tightening around him, forcing him to confront whatever was lurking beneath the surface of his reality. "What do you want from me?" James asked, trying to steady his breath. His hands were clammy, his heart a drumbeat in his chest. The figure tilted its head, as though considering the question carefully before speaking again. To understand is to be bound, it replied. To know the truth is to carry its weight. James's mind raced. What did that mean? He had already seen things that defied reason and logic, things that shouldn't exist. His time in the pit, the symbols on the walls, the abyss that had almost consumed him. All of it pointed to something ancient, something deeply embedded in the very foundation of Wilson's Corner. But what? What was the connection? Why me? He asked, almost pleading. Why was I chosen to uncover this? The figure's voice softened, becoming almost melancholic, yet still carrying the weight of an unspoken burden. Because you are not the first. Others have come before you, seeking the same answers, but none have understood. It paused, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of something in the figure's eyes, something like pity, or perhaps something darker. You, James, you are the one who can see the threads that bind this place to the darkness, the one who can unravel the veil. The veil? James echoed, his mind racing to keep up. What veil? The figure reached out a hand, and in that moment, the room seemed to stretch, the walls warping and bending. James's vision blurred, and for a second, it felt as though the very fabric of reality had slipped. He saw flashes, images that were not his own, images that were old, ancient. He saw the town of Wilson's Corner, centuries before it had been settled, a land teeming with life and yet shrouded in shadows. He saw rituals, strange symbols, sacrifices to something unseen. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, all bound by the same forces, the same darkness that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. And then, as quickly as the vision had come, it was gone. The room returned to normal, the figure still standing before him, its hand lowered. The veil is what separates the known from the unknown, it explained, its voice more urgent now. It is the boundary between what the world has forgotten and what it is terrified to remember. And it is beginning to tear. James's stomach churned. He could feel the truth of the figure's words in his bones, as though the very ground beneath him were trembling with the weight of the revelation. Why is it tearing? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because the time has come, the figure answered. The old world is returning. The forces that were once sealed away, locked beneath the earth, are stirring. And you, James, you are the key. James staggered back, the weight of those words pressing down on him like a crushing wave. The key. He had known, deep down, that this was bigger than just Wilson's Corner, that the mystery he had uncovered was not just a local story, but something that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. But the truth, the key, it was too much for him to process. What does that mean? He demanded, his voice shaking. What do I have to do? The figure stepped closer, its form shifting slightly in the shadows, and for the first time, it seemed to regard him with something akin to empathy. You must decide, James. You must choose whether you will carry the weight of the truth, or whether you will turn away and let the world fall back into the darkness. Either way, the veil will tear. It is only a matter of time. The air around them grew heavy again, the whispers rising in a crescendo, the room vibrating with an unseen energy. The symbols on the walls began to glow once more, their shapes shifting and merging into one unified, unbreakable pattern. You cannot escape this, the figure said softly, almost sadly. You have already seen too much. James felt a pang of despair, his knees threatening to buckle under the pressure of the truth that was now crashing down upon him. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him. His decision would change everything. But how could he choose when the path ahead was so unclear? What was the right thing to do? Before he could gather his thoughts, the figure spoke one final time. Remember, James, it said, its voice now barely a whisper. The truth is not something that can be forgotten. You can only choose how to carry it. And with that, the figure faded into the shadows, leaving James alone in the silence of the church, the air thick with the echoes of things far older than he could comprehend. The veil was tearing. The question now was whether James would be its savior or its harbinger. James stood motionless, the figure's words hanging in the air like a death knell. His mind reeled, trying to process what he had just witnessed, what he had learned. The very foundation of his world had shifted. What was once solid now seemed fragile, breaking apart at the edges. He was no longer just a man caught in the web of small-town secrets. He was a player in something much larger, something older. The whispers still lingered, now distant but persistent. The symbols on the walls of the church continued to pulse, their glow softening as if fading into the ether. But James could no longer deny the truth. Whatever the figure was, whatever it had revealed, it was undeniable. The veil that separated the known from the unknown, the surface world from the shadowed depths beneath it, was ripping apart. And the worst part was that he couldn't decide whether he was more terrified of what lay beyond that veil, or the fact that he might be the one to unravel it all. He stepped forward, his feet heavy as if the weight of the air itself was pulling him down. His hand hovered over one of the glowing symbols on the church wall. It felt warm under his touch, the energy from it tingling up his arm, a quiet hum echoing in his bones. The symbol pulsed once, then twice. He pulled his hand away, as though he were afraid it might burn him, and stared at the intricate design. An ancient rune, its edges jagged, its meaning lost to time. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The question gnawed at him. Why me? Why was I the one chosen? He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't sought out the mysteries of Wilson's Corner, hadn't gone looking for the secrets hidden beneath the surface of the town. All he had wanted was to understand. But now, he was caught in a tide he couldn't escape. The figure's words echoed in his mind. You are the key. The key. James stumbled out of the church, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his body trembling. He needed air. He needed space to think. The town seemed unnaturally quiet as he stepped into the street, the night sky hanging low and heavy above him. The moon was obscured by dark clouds, casting the town in an eerie, diffused light. The cobblestone roads felt unfamiliar under his feet, as if the town had subtly shifted, its contours warped by the knowledge now seeping into his mind. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their windows dark and watchful, as if they too knew the truth that James was only beginning to comprehend. He couldn't stay here. Not tonight. He needed to find answers. He needed to find someone who could help him understand the enormity of what he had learned. But who could he trust? Who in this town would even know? His thoughts drifted back to Emily. She had known more about the town's history than anyone, perhaps even more than she realized. She had been the one to guide him through the maze of symbols and clues that had led him to this point. But had she known the true nature of what was happening? Had she understood the implications of the veil tearing? With a new sense of urgency, James made his way to her apartment. He couldn't let the night pass without speaking to her, without sharing the weight of the revelation that now pressed down on him. When he reached her building, the lights were still on in her window. He felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe she was still awake. Maybe she was waiting for him. He hurried up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. He knocked on her door, his hand trembling. There was a long pause before Emily answered, her face drawn and tired, as though she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. I don't know what's happening, James said, his voice strained. I don't know what any of it means. Emily closed the door behind him and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. You've seen it, haven't you? She said softly. James's heart sank. What? Seen what? The truth, Emily whispered. I didn't think you'd be ready for it. I thought you'd leave it alone, that you'd walk away before it became too much. James was stunned. You knew? I suspected, she replied, her gaze distant. There have been signs. Things I couldn't explain. Things that have been happening in the town for years, long before either of us were born. James's mind raced. What do you mean? What signs? What things? Emily motioned for him to sit on the couch. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, focused. I've been researching the town's history. It goes back centuries. There are old records, documents hidden in the town archives, records that have been sealed for a reason. What records? James asked, leaning forward. What are you talking about? Emily sighed. rubbing her temples as though the weight of her knowledge was too much to bear. The town wasn't founded the way you think. It wasn't just a group of settlers looking for a place to live. They came here because they were drawn to something that was already here, something ancient. The veil, James said quietly. She nodded. The veil. And it's been weakening for years. That's why the town has always been strange. Why people leave, why there are disappearances, why things feel off. James's mind was spinning. But why now? Why is it happening now? Emily looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. Because you're here, James. You're the one who found the key. The weight of her words hit him like a blow. He had no more time to waste. The veil was tearing, and the darkness that lurked beyond it was closer than he had ever imagined. There was no turning back now. The question wasn't whether he could stop it. The question was, what was he willing to sacrifice to keep it from consuming them all? The silence in Emily's apartment was suffocating, the air thick with the unspoken weight of everything they had just revealed. James could hear the steady beat of his own heart, each thump loud in his ears as he struggled to comprehend the enormity of what was at stake. The veil, the key, the ancient darkness. It all felt like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from, yet it was all too real. Emily's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that there was no turning back. You're the one who found the key. It wasn't just some random phrase. It was a statement of purpose, a terrible truth that meant James was somehow central to the destruction or salvation of everything he had known. The church, the symbols, the figure in the shadows, they had all been leading him here. But where was here? What was he supposed to do now? He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his own uncertainty pressing down on him. I don't understand. How am I supposed to stop it? What is it that I'm supposed to stop? Emily's gaze hardened as she looked at him, a fire that James hadn't seen before igniting in her eyes. The darkness, the thing behind the veil. It's been waiting for centuries to break free. Every generation, every soul it's claimed, it's all been part of a larger plan. She paused, glancing away as though searching for the right words. You are the last chance we have to stop it. The key is a person, the one who has the ability to unlock the doorway between our world and whatever lies beyond. And if it's opened fully, she let the thought hang in the air. James didn't need her to finish. He already knew. If the darkness fully crossed into their world, there would be no stopping it. The town, and perhaps much more, would fall under its dominion. I didn't ask for this, James muttered, standing up abruptly. I didn't ask to be the key. I just wanted answers, Emily. Just answers. His voice wavered, raw with the strain of everything he was trying to process. Emily stood too, moving toward him with an intensity that startled him. I know. None of us asked for this. But it's happening, whether you like it or not. You can't ignore it anymore. James turned his back on her for a moment, as if the very act of facing the truth would be enough to force the reality of it into some manageable shape. But all he felt was the weight of uncertainty. Then what do I do now? He asked, his voice hoarse. Where do we even begin? There's only one place, Emily said, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear that James could sense lingering in her words. The church. That's where the veil is thinnest. That's where we can stop it, or where it all ends. James nodded slowly, feeling a strange pull in his gut. He knew what she was saying was true. The church, the symbols, the ancient energies. It had all led him there. The answers, the key, the way to stop the darkness, it was all tied to that place. But as he thought about it, a deep unease gnawed at him. If the veil was thin there, if the darkness was already trying to break through, what would happen if they failed? Emily, James began, turning back to face her. Are you sure we can do this? That I can do this? Her gaze softened, and for the first time, there was something almost like pity in her eyes. I don't know, but I do know this. You're the only one who can try. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, weathered journal. It looked ancient, the leather cover cracked and worn. She handed it to him. What is this? He asked, his fingers tracing the intricate designs on the cover. It's the key to understanding how to seal the veil, she said softly. It belonged to my great-grandfather. He was one of the last to study the rituals, before everything was lost. He didn't have time to finish what he started, but he left enough clues in there to guide us. It's our only hope. James took the journal, his fingers brushing over the pages as if he could feel the weight of history itself in them. The symbols that filled the pages were familiar, yet different, more intricate, more complex than the ones in the church. "Where do we begin?" he asked, already flipping through the pages. Emily leaned over, her breath catching as she pointed to a particular set of symbols. These are the instructions. They'll lead you through the steps to close the veil, if you can understand them. James's heart pounded in his chest. "And if I can't?" Emily was silent for a moment before answering, her voice small, almost resigned. "Then the veil will open completely, and everything we've known will be swallowed by whatever is waiting on the other side." The silence between them felt heavier than before, suffocating. James's eyes lingered on the page, trying to decipher the cryptic symbols. It was overwhelming. How could he possibly understand it all? How could he hope to contain something as ancient and powerful as the darkness? He closed the journal with a snap, the finality of the sound making the air feel even more oppressive. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, Emily," he admitted, his voice thick with doubt. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly steady. "You're stronger than you think. And whether you're ready or not, this is the path we have to take." The decision was made. There was no going back. James stared at the journal in his hands, the weight of it pressing down on him. The church, the veil, the ancient darkness. It all led to one final confrontation. There was no more time for hesitation. The door between worlds was already opening, and he had no choice but to step through it, whether he was ready or not. He took a deep breath, the words from the figure in the church echoing once again in his mind. "You are the key, but what will you unlock?" That, James realized, was the question that would define everything. The night felt oppressive as James and Emily approached the old church. It loomed ahead of them like a monolith, its spires reaching into the sky like jagged claws, cutting through the thick fog that had begun to roll in. The streets were empty, an eerie stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the world into a dim, unnatural darkness. "This place," James murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that the church was watching them, that it had been waiting for this moment. For him, he could almost feel the weight of the veil, thick and suffocating, pulling him toward it like some ancient, magnetic force. Emily's face was set in determination, though there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "We have to go inside," she said. "It's the only way. The ritual can't be performed from outside. The symbols in the journal, if we follow them to the letter, we can close the veil." James nodded, though a part of him felt that there was more to this than just the ritual. He had read the journal, or at least the parts he could decipher. The instructions were cryptic, layered with symbols that made his head spin. But there was one thing that stood out, the key. Not just the physical key he had found in the church, but a key that unlocked something much deeper within the building. Something older. He swallowed hard, the weight of the journal in his backpack a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. They reached the massive wooden doors of the church, their ancient hinges creaking as they slowly pushed open. The air inside was thick, stale, and carried the faint scent of incense and mildew. The flickering light of their torches cast long shadows against the walls, stretching and distorting the faded frescoes that lined the interior. The symbols from the journal seemed to pulse in the corners of his mind, like an echo from the past. "I don't like this," James muttered, his eyes scanning the room. The church, once a place of peace and reverence, now felt like a tomb. There was something unsettling in the air, something that felt wrong. "We don't have a choice," Emily replied, her voice firm. "We need to get to the altar. That's where the veil is thinnest." James nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened with every step. They made their way down the long aisle, the sound of their footsteps amplified in the stillness. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with color, now looked dull and lifeless, as if they too were succumbing to the darkness creeping in from the edges of the room. At the far end of the church, the altar stood, An imposing structure carved from dark stone, its surface covered in dust and debris. The symbols etched into it were familiar, and James could feel the pull of them, like a magnetic field drawing him in. "Is this where we start?" James asked, his voice barely audible as he stood before the altar, eyeing the strange markings. Emily stepped forward, pulling out the journal and flipping to the marked page. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read aloud, the words a strange cadence, almost like a chant. The symbols from the journal seemed to shift and writhe before his eyes, their meaning just out of reach. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. James hesitated, his heart pounding. The darkness was here. He could feel it, pressing against his skin, clawing at his mind. The ritual, whatever it was, seemed to be their only hope. But what if it wasn't enough? What if opening the veil was only the beginning? Taking a deep breath, James nodded. "Let's do it." Emily began to trace the symbols on the altar with her fingers, speaking the words of the ritual. As she did, the air grew colder, the shadows in the church lengthening. The candles lining the room flickered, their flames sputtering as if struggling to stay alive. James could hear a faint whisper, like the sound of distant voices, but when he tried to focus, it was gone. The church groaned, the old stone walls shifting as though something was stirring beneath them. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, a deep, primal fear clawing at him. He glanced at Emily, but her face was pale, her eyes locked on the symbols she was tracing. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook, the tremors making the walls crack and the windows rattle. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the church, so deep it felt as though it came from the earth itself. The temperature dropped even further, and James could see his breath fogging in front of him. "It's happening," Emily gasped, her voice strained. "We need to finish it now." James stepped forward, pulling the key from his pocket. It pulsed in his hand, warm and heavy, as though it were alive. The faint whispering grew louder, and the shadows in the corners of the church seemed to shift and writhe, as if they were alive, hungry. His heart raced as he approached the altar, the key trembling in his hand. He had no idea what he was supposed to do with it, but he knew, in that moment, that it was the final piece. The church had been waiting for him to unlock it, to let whatever force was trapped within break free. The moment he inserted the key into a small, hidden lock on the altar, the entire church trembled. A crack appeared in the air, like a tear in reality itself. The veil had thinned too much, and the darkness that had been lurking beyond was now pushing through. The whispers turned into screams, the sound of voices, pleading, angry, and terrified, all blending together in a maddening cacophony. James could feel the darkness closing in around him, its icy fingers brushing against his skin. The key, it had opened the doorway. "What have we done?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising tide of chaos. James's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back, the enormity of what he had just unleashed sinking in. The veil wasn't just a barrier, it was a prison. And now, the darkness was free. But it wasn't over yet. There was still a chance. They had to close it, before it consumed everything. "We can still stop it," James said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "We have to." But as the dark force poured through the tear in reality, James realized one terrible truth. There was no going back. The air in the church had grown thick, oppressive, as if it were alive and breathing. James felt his lungs tightening, his every inhale a struggle against the weight of the darkness. The rift in reality, that crack in the fabric of the world, was widening. It pulsed with an unnatural light, flickering between shades of red and black, like the eye of some ancient, malevolent god, watching and waiting. The whispers, now a chorus of shrieks, clawed at his mind, digging into his thoughts like daggers. Each scream seemed to scrape away a little more of his sanity. Emily stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. She had stopped tracing the symbols on the altar, her hands trembling in front of her. "James," she whispered, barely able to get the words out, "I don't know how to stop this. The ritual, it's incomplete. The key, it was never supposed to open the rift." James turned to her, his mind racing. The journal had been clear. The key was supposed to unlock something hidden, but it wasn't just about opening the door. It was about controlling what came through. And now the darkness, the force trapped behind the veil, was spilling into the world, unchecked and unstoppable. "What do you mean?" he asked urgently, his voice rising above the shrieks that echoed around them. "There has to be a way to fix it. We have to close it, Emily. We can't just let it consume everything." I don't know," Emily stammered. She looked frantic, pulling the journal from her bag and flipping through the pages as the air in the church grew colder. Her fingers slid over the worn pages, desperately searching for something that could help. But the symbols, the words, they no longer made sense. They were shifting, warping as the rift twisted the very air around them. Suddenly, a blast of cold air slammed into them, knocking James to the ground. He gasped for breath as the temperature plummeted, the chill creeping into his bones. He looked up and saw the rift widen even further, the fabric of reality tearing apart like an old piece of cloth being shredded by unseen hands. A shadow moved within the rift, an enormous, dark shape, shifting and writhing like smoke. It seemed to grow in size with every passing second, and James could feel its power, its hunger. He could hear it now, the voice of whatever was trapped within. It was speaking to him, but not with words. It was something deeper, a primal call that reverberated through his very soul. "James!" Emily's voice was barely audible above the chaos. "The ritual, it needs a sacrifice. The key was meant to unlock the rift, but it requires a life to seal it again. It's the only way to stop it." James's stomach twisted. A sacrifice? He had known, deep down, that there was a price to pay, but the reality of it, the sheer weight of the decision, was unbearable. He had to choose. Who would it be? The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were no longer just voices. They were thoughts, invasive and overwhelming. James could feel his mind starting to unravel. The darkness was reaching out to him, calling for him to step forward, to give himself to it. He could sense it, the pull, the allure. It was tempting, so tempting. But Emily, she was there, beside him, just as desperate, just as afraid. He couldn't let her make the sacrifice. Not her. "Emily," James said, his voice trembling as he stood up, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. "We need to stop this. We need to make the sacrifice together. If we can find the right ritual, we can close the rift without losing anyone." Emily looked at him, her expression tormented. "We don't have a choice, James. The darkness won't stop until it consumes everything. The key was never supposed to be used. It was just a means to trap whatever was beyond the veil. But now we're the ones who have to pay the price." "No," James said firmly. "We'll find another way." He could feel the ground shaking beneath him again, the church groaning as the rift continued to widen. The shadow inside it was growing, its shape becoming clearer now. A massive, inky figure, its form too monstrous to fully comprehend, with eyes like black holes that seemed to devour all light. The air itself seemed to vibrate with its presence, and James felt his bones ache as though they were being crushed under the weight of it. He could see Emily's fear in her eyes, and for a moment, he thought he saw something else there, a flicker of understanding. She knew that they were running out of time, that the very essence of the world was crumbling around them. "We can't run anymore," she whispered. "We can't hide from it. The only way out is through." James stared at the rift, at the dark figure emerging from it, its tendrils reaching for the world, hungry and relentless. He could feel the pull, the pressure, the overwhelming need to give in. It was so easy. All he had to do was step forward, make the sacrifice, and end it. But he couldn't do it. Not like this. Suddenly, a voice cut through the madness, a clear, sharp command that pierced through the air. "James, Emily, look at the altar." James turned, following the voice to the altar, where the key was now glowing faintly. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and as he stepped closer, he saw that the symbols on the altar had begun to shift again. They weren't just random markings. They were forming a new pattern, one that seemed to resonate with something deep inside him. The ritual wasn't over. It had changed. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to finish it without sacrifice. He glanced at Emily. We can still close it. We can still fix this. But as he stepped forward to complete the ritual, the rift surged, and the dark figure let out a deafening roar that shook the church to its very foundations. The ground split open beneath them, and James could see the endless void beyond. Nothingness, pure and empty, a place where the rift would lead if left unchecked. Emily grabbed his arm. It's now or never. We can't stop it if we don't do it together. Together. James nodded, his heart pounding as he placed his hand on the altar, his fingers brushing against the key. The symbols were shifting faster now, the energy building with each passing second. They had one chance. The air crackled with tension, the very fabric of reality warping under the pressure of the rift. James could feel the weight of the key in his hand, its smooth surface warm with the heat of the ritual, vibrating with an ancient power that seemed to thrash against his grasp. He knew, in this moment, that there was no turning back. The rift was alive, and if they didn't finish what they had started, everything would be lost. Emily stood beside him, her fingers trembling as she traced the symbols on the altar, trying to keep the pattern intact. Her face was drawn, pale, but there was a fire in her eyes, a resolve that matched his own. Together, they could end this. Together, they could stop the darkness from consuming everything. James, Emily said, her voice tight with urgency, we have to activate the key. It's the only way to stabilize the ritual. Once it's done, the rift will close. But the energy is volatile. We need to channel it. He nodded, swallowing hard. The shadow in the rift was now fully visible, a massive, grotesque form, its tendrils stretching out like spider legs, reaching for the world. Its eyes, vast and void-like, locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He could hear it, feel it inside his mind, the deep hunger, the insatiable need to break free. Let's do it, he said, voice firm, though his heart raced in his chest. Emily stepped closer, placing her hand on the altar beside his. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter, the light intensifying with each passing moment. They could hear the rift beginning to hum, the pitch rising until it was almost unbearable, vibrating through the very bones of the church. The power inside the ritual was building, and the key seemed to pulse in rhythm with the rift. James closed his eyes, feeling the presence of the dark entity pressing in on him, clawing at his thoughts. He could feel its breath on his skin, the pull of its power, promising him freedom from the madness, from the chaos. All he had to do was surrender, just a little, but he fought it, clinging to his sanity. He wasn't going to fall into the trap. We have to focus, Emily urged, her voice strained. The key is the anchor. It can't waver. With a deep breath, James steadied himself. He focused on the key, on the ancient symbols carved into it, and on the power that surged through his veins. He could feel the rift tugging at him, but he refused to be pulled in. He would stand his ground. They would stand together. The key in his hand began to glow with a brilliant light, and the ground beneath them cracked open, sending tremors through the church. The shadow in the rift screamed, a deafening, shrieking sound that echoed in every corner of the room, shaking the very foundation of the building. James could feel the air thickening, becoming charged with the energy of the ritual. Time seemed to stretch and distort, as though the world were holding its breath. Now, Emily gasped, her voice almost lost beneath the roar of the rift. We finish it. In one synchronized movement, they pressed the key into the altar, activating the ritual with a final, resounding click. The air exploded with light. The rift shuddered violently, its vast form convulsing as the energy from the key surged through the altar. The dark figure inside the rift howled in fury, its tendrils whipping violently, but the light from the key was unrelenting. It burned with a purity that seemed to push the darkness back, slowly but steadily, like the rising sun banishing the night. James could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the power of the ritual almost too much to bear. He gripped the altar, his knuckles white, his breath ragged. But he refused to look away. They were so close. They had come too far to fail now. The rift began to contract, its vast form shrinking, its screams fading into silence. But even as it shrank, it fought back with a ferocity that made the ground tremble. The dark presence, once powerful and unyielding, was slowly being pulled back into the void, its influence retreating. But there was something else, something more insidious. The energy of the rift was unstable, and it began to ripple outward, threatening to destroy everything in its wake. "It's not over," Emily cried out, her face twisted in fear. "The key, it can't hold it forever." The rift wasn't closing fast enough. The church, the world itself, seemed to be shaking apart. Pieces of the ceiling cracked and fell, and the walls trembled under the strain. The rift was unstable. If they didn't do something, it would tear everything apart. James looked at the altar, at the energy swirling around it, and realized with a sickening clarity what had to be done. The key had to be sealed, but the ritual required a final act of sacrifice. The key's power wasn't infinite. It needed an anchor, a vessel to channel the remaining energy, to seal the rift permanently. "Emily," James said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "I have to do it. I have to take the energy." She stared at him, horror in her eyes. "James, no. You can't." "I have no choice," he said, stepping forward. "It's the only way to make sure the rift doesn't tear open again. I have to be the one to finish this." Without waiting for her response, James placed both hands on the altar, feeling the overwhelming surge of energy course through him. The power was intense, like 1,000 storms converging within him, and he could feel himself starting to burn from the inside out. It was a pain that was beyond anything he had ever experienced, a searing, unbearable heat, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Emily screamed his name, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the rift. James's vision blurred, the edges of reality warping, twisting as the energy flowed into him. His skin burned, his heart raced, and his muscles locked in agony. But he held on, determined not to let the darkness win. And then, just as the rift began to pulse one final time, everything went still. The light from the key intensified, blinding in its brilliance, and with a deafening crack, the rift collapsed, folding in on itself. The dark presence inside was consumed by the light, its form dissolving into nothingness. The whispers, the screams, the chaos, all of it disappeared in an instant. James collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his body shuddering as the last remnants of the ritual faded. The church was silent, the air clear, the oppressive weight lifted. The rift was gone. Emily rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face as she knelt beside him. "James, you did it. You stopped it." But James could barely hear her words. The energy had taken its toll. He could feel it draining from him, his strength slipping away. He had given everything to close the rift, and now he was empty. As his vision began to fade, he looked up at Emily one last time, a faint smile crossing his lips. "We did it," he whispered, before everything went dark, and the world, at least for now, was safe. The world had changed. It was subtle, at first, like the lingering echo of a nightmare that faded as the sun rose. But as the days passed, the effects of the ritual began to manifest. The rift was gone, and with it, the dark force that had sought to unravel everything. But the cost was not without its consequences. James never woke up. At first, Emily refused to believe it. She had clung to hope, spending sleepless nights by his side in the hospital, holding his hand, praying for a miracle. But there was no miracle. There was only silence. His body had survived the ritual, but his mind, it had been consumed by the power, stretched beyond its limits. His spirit had been bound to the altar, a final anchor to close the rift. He had given everything, his strength, his life, to ensure the world would be safe. But the safety he had secured came at the price of his own existence. The funeral was small. Only a handful of people attended, those who had been touched by the strange and terrifying events that had unfolded. Emily stood at the front, her eyes red from crying, her heart shattered. She had lost James. She had lost the one person who had stood by her, who had fought beside her, and whose love had given her strength when everything seemed lost. There were no words that could fill the void left behind. No comforting assurances that could ease the grief. All Emily could do was remember the man who had sacrificed everything for the world, for her, for all of them. In the months that followed, Emily found herself drawn back to the church. It was a place of both victory and loss, a place where the world had been saved but at a steep cost. She visited often, sitting in the pews, thinking about everything that had happened, wondering if there had been another way. But deep down, she knew the answer. There had been no other choice. The rift was sealed, and the darkness that had threatened to consume everything had been stopped. But the burden of that knowledge weighed heavily on her. She had survived. She had walked away. But at what cost? In the quiet solitude of the church, Emily could still feel James's presence. It was faint, like a whisper on the wind, but it was there. His sacrifice had not been in vain. He had ensured the world would continue, and she would honor his memory, carrying the weight of his legacy. The darkness was gone, but she knew the world would never be the same. And neither would she. Months after James's heroism at the gas station, the quiet town had returned to its regular rhythm. Yet, there was something in the air, something that people couldn't quite put their fingers on. The energy had shifted. A lingering sense of unease haunted the community, a whisper of what might come next. People were no longer afraid to talk about the incident openly, but behind those conversations, behind the gestures of gratitude and pride, there was a collective sense of wonder and fear. Was this the end, or just the beginning? For Emily, the days passed in a haze. At first, she tried to focus on her family, her daughter, and the mundane details of life. There were moments of joy, like the first snowfall of the season or Emma's birthday party. But something was missing. She had heard the rumors, of course. Some said that James had been the one to close the rift. Others whispered that he had done something far more significant than they realized. Emily didn't care to speculate. It wasn't the unknown that haunted her. It was the absence, the gaping hole that James had left in their lives. She found herself returning to the woods where he had fought and fallen. It wasn't a place of sorrow anymore. It had become a place of remembrance, a place where she could feel close to him again. She could almost hear the sound of his footsteps, feel his presence in the wind that rustled the leaves. As much as she longed to see him, to hear him speak again, she knew that those days were gone. She would never again feel the warmth of his hand in hers, or hear the steady beat of his heart next to hers. The woods, once a place of peace and serenity, now felt like the crossroads of fate, the place where it all had changed. One cold evening, as Emily stood at the edge of the clearing where James had stood his ground against the bikers, she heard a rustling behind her. Her body tensed. For a moment, she thought it was a bear, or perhaps another animal searching for food in the forest. But when she turned around, she found herself staring at an unexpected figure. It was a man, a stranger to her. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that carried the weight of someone who had seen far too much. His clothes were worn, and his eyes, although tired, were sharp and observant. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The man stood still for a moment before answering, his voice deep and steady. "I'm someone who's been looking for you." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had been alone in these woods for months, and the thought of someone else knowing where to find her here was unsettling. Yet, there was something about the way he spoke, something familiar, that made her hesitate before she responded. "Why are you here?" she asked, keeping her distance, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife James had once carried. "I need to speak with you," the man said. "It's important. There's a darkness, something far worse than anything you've faced before. And it's coming." Emily's stomach churned. She had heard of such things. Dark forces that never truly went away, that lurked, waiting to rise again when the world least expected it. But she wasn't sure what to make of this man. "Who are you?" she repeated, her voice firmer now. "What do you know about me, about James?" The stranger's gaze softened, almost as if he had been expecting her to ask. James did more than just fight off a group of bikers. He closed a door that should never have been opened. And now, there are those who want to open it again. They will stop at nothing to bring the darkness back. Emily felt a chill creep down her spine. She wanted to reject the man's words, to dismiss them as another wild claim. But deep down, she knew there was truth in them. "Who are they?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "They're a group of people who think they can control it. They believe that they can harness the power of what James closed, and they will do anything to get it back." Emily's heart raced. James had closed a door to something powerful, something dark. Could it really be true? Had his sacrifice been part of something larger than she could understand? "I've come to warn you," the man continued. "You're the key. James's blood, his power, it's still with you, and they will stop at nothing to get to you." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Emily felt her mind race, trying to make sense of it all. Was it true? Had James's sacrifice bound something dark to her, to their family? And if so, what did that mean for her daughter? For the future? Before she could ask more, the man turned, stepping back toward the trees. "I can help you," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "But you have to trust me. They are coming, and when they do, you'll need more than just memories to protect you." And with that, he disappeared into the woods, leaving Emily standing alone, her thoughts a whirlwind. Emily didn't know what to believe. The man's words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't understand what they meant. James's power still with her? It was impossible. She had already mourned his loss. She had already come to terms with the fact that he was gone. But the man's warning stuck with her, gnawing at her as she returned to her daily routine. The whispers of a new threat grew louder, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly where or when it would arrive. All she knew was that it was inevitable. Weeks passed, and the small town seemed to fall back into a sense of normalcy. People went about their daily lives, unaware of the dark presence that lurked just beneath the surface. But Emily felt it, every day, a growing unease, a shadow that had followed her since the day she stepped into those woods. And then, one fateful evening, it happened. She was driving home from work when she saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of figures, cloaked in shadows, standing on the edge of town, their faces hidden. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as if waiting. Her heart raced as she slammed on the brakes. Her instincts, honed from years of living with danger, screamed at her to turn around. But before she could, one of them stepped forward, their face emerging from the darkness. It was the man, the one who had warned her. But now, his face was twisted with something dark, something unrecognizable. And behind him, she could see the figures of others, all as shadowed as he. "You shouldn't have come back," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But the man only smiled, his teeth sharp and gleaming. "You didn't think we'd forget, did you? James's death didn't close anything. It only bought time." And with that, the darkness descended, and the world as Emily knew it would never be the same again. The days that followed felt like a blur. Emily had been thrust into a new, terrifying reality where she couldn't escape the feeling that something far darker was stirring beneath the surface. The man, whose name she still didn't know, had warned her that the darkness wasn't gone. It was only waiting for the right moment to rise again. And now, it seemed, that moment had arrived. As she lay in bed, her mind racing, she couldn't help but replay the events of the past few days over and over again. The strange man in the woods, his cryptic warnings, and then the chilling encounter on the edge of town. Who were these people? What did they want? And what exactly had James done that had bound her to this darkness? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, a connection she couldn't yet understand. But as the days turned into weeks, the threat became harder to ignore. Strange occurrences began to happen all around her. The weather seemed to shift without warning, the skies darkening with unnatural clouds. Animals behaved erratically, appearing skittish and disoriented. People in town began to whisper about strange sights in the woods, figures moving in the shadows, glowing lights at the edge of the forest, and eerie noises that echoed through the night. And then came the dreams. At first, they were subtle, a feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond her reach. But soon, the dreams became vivid. She saw herself standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness, feeling a pull, an irresistible force drawing her closer. The closer she got to the trees, the more the darkness seemed to surround her, suffocating her, consuming her. Each time she woke from these dreams, she felt more and more certain of one thing. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever force James had kept at bay, was not only real, it was alive, and it was coming for her. It was a cold evening when the figure appeared at her door. She had been sitting in the living room, trying to make sense of everything, when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door cautiously, expecting to see one of her neighbors, or maybe someone with a lost dog. But when she looked up, she found herself staring into the same shadowed eyes she had seen in the woods. It was the man again. "I told you it wasn't over," he said, his voice grim. Before she could respond, he stepped past her into the house, his presence imposing and unsettling. "We don't have much time. They're coming." "Who?" Emily asked, closing the door behind him. "Who are they?" "They're the ones who've been watching," the man said. "The ones who think they can control what was sealed away. And now, they've found a way to open it again. They're trying to harness the power of the rift, use it to bend the world to their will. But they don't understand it. They don't know what they're dealing with." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was real. The terror, the unease, it was all connected to the rift, to whatever James had sealed away. But how was she supposed to stop it? "You're the key," the man said, as if reading her thoughts. James knew it. That's why he fought so hard to close the rift. He knew it would come down to you. You're the one who can prevent it from opening again. "But I don't know how," Emily replied, her voice shaky. The man's eyes softened, and for a moment, he almost seemed human again. "You don't have to do it alone. There are others. There are people who've been keeping watch, who've been preparing for this day. We can help you. But you have to act quickly." Before she could ask any more questions, the door slammed open, and several figures stepped inside, their presence as unnerving as the man's. Emily froze, her mind scrambling to process what was happening. "We've been waiting for you," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. The group of strangers who had entered her home weren't exactly what Emily had expected. They weren't the kind of people who blended into a small town like this. They were rough-looking, some with scars and tattoos, others with an air of experience that spoke of battles fought and won, or lost. They all had the same intense look in their eyes, as if they had seen too much of the world's darkness. One man stepped forward. He was older than the rest, his face lined with age and experience. "We've been hunting them for years," he said, his voice filled with authority. "The ones who want to open the rift. They call themselves the Order of the Eclipse. They've been gathering power, waiting for the right moment. And now they're ready." "The Order of the Eclipse?" Emily repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. Are they the ones behind all this?" The man nodded. "Yes. They've been waiting for the right person, the right bloodline, to unlock the rift. And they think they've found it in you." Emily recoiled. "Me? Why me?" The man's gaze darkened. "Because of James. Because of what he did. He sealed the rift, but he didn't destroy it. He bound it with his blood. And now, his bloodline, the one he left behind, holds the key to reopening it." Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. James had sacrificed everything to close the rift, to protect their world. And now, she was the one who had to stop it from being undone. "You have to train," the man continued. "You need to learn how to defend yourself, how to fight back. The Order won't stop until they've succeeded." Emily's mind raced. She felt completely unprepared, overwhelmed. How was she supposed to fight something so powerful? She had no training, no knowledge of the ancient forces that were now threatening her world. But as the man spoke, she realized one thing. She had no choice. If she didn't act, everything James had done, everything he had sacrificed, would be in vain. For the next few weeks, Emily trained with the group. She learned quickly, though not without struggle. Her body ached from the physical exercises, her mind struggled to absorb the ancient knowledge they imparted. The world she had known, her small town, her peaceful life, was slipping away, replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The figures who had arrived at her door became her allies, mentors, and protectors. Among them was a woman named Sarah, who had been tracking the Order for years. She was sharp, resourceful, and more than willing to help Emily understand what was at stake. Through her, Emily learned more about the Rift, its origins, and the terrifying power it contained. Sarah told her that the Rift was not just a door. It was a conduit, a link between their world and something far darker. The Order believed they could control it, but that was a lie. The Rift had never been meant to be controlled. It was something that should never have been opened in the first place. And now, the time had come. The Order of the Eclipse was moving, and Emily was the only one who could stop them. The battle for the future of their world had begun.